This is King World News. I'm Eric King, and you're about to hear the interview with Peter Schiff of Euro-Pacific Capital, who's considering a run for Senate. Remember to go to our homepage at www.kingworldnews.com for more interviews, where this week we have Bob Prechter from Elliott Wave International, as well as Jeff Burns, CEO of Pan American Silver. Joining us now is Peter Schiff, president of Euro-Pacific Capital. Last time you were interviewed here on King World News, you made the following statement, quote, "We are going down a slippery slope, and every time we do one thing, we create a bigger problem. So the government usurps more and more power to try and solve it. And so if you just connect the dots, we're going to get exchange controls. We're going to have black markets. We're going to have price controls. We're going to have shortages. All sorts of bad things are going to happen because of one mistake after another that I see happening right now, because nobody is standing up and saying this is wrong. It's like the government is trying to put out a fire with gasoline, so the fire just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and instead of questioning what they are doing, they just reach for more gasoline," end quote. I want to talk to you about your potential run for Congress now, because you have talked about this country's problems, and you said in that last interview, nobody's standing up and saying this is wrong. My question for you is, what compelled you to consider running? Because something compelled you to take this step. What was it that pushed you over the edge, Peter?
Well, just watching, what they're doing. Watching what Congress is doing, one mistake after another, understanding how serious these problems are and what's going to happen to this country if we don't put a stop to what they're doing.
From the Hartford Courant yesterday, it's twilight in Peter Schiff's America, and if painful and drastic changes aren't made soon, he foresees an economic depression lasting at least a decade. The future as envisioned by Schiff will be marked by rampant inflation. A gallon of gas could cost $10, food shortages and rolling blackouts unless government sharply shrinks and the free market is allowed to flourish, end quote. What do we need to do here, Peter, in order to avoid that bleak future?
Well, we've got to stop what we're doing right now. We've got to let the markets function. We've got to understand, though, that the recession is actually a necessary cleansing process, that the mistakes were built up over the years, and it's during the recession that we finally deal with those mistakes. And we have to rebuild a viable economy again. We can't just keep spending borrowed money and growing government. We have to save our money. We have to produce again. We have to make capital investments, and we have to shrink government. But weaning us from the bubble economy to a legitimate economy, there's going to be some short-term transitional pain. But if we simply try to avoid the pain, we're going to be in agony.
You stated recently, or it was in another article, the current crisis is payback for a decade of reckless monetary policy, Schiff says. The recession is not the problem. The recession is the cure. It's not fun, just like heroin withdrawal is not fun, but it's necessary. Why is the government continually standing in the way of us cleansing the system, Peter?
Because they don't want to admit that there's a problem. And we have a problem because of their monetary policy and their fiscal policy. And they want to tell us that everything is great. They want us to believe that it's just a function of getting more credit flowing, that getting consumers back into the shopping centers and in the auto showroom, if they can just get enough spending that we can get the economy back. But that's not the way it works. The more we spend, the bigger the hole we're going to dig for ourselves. That's what they don't want to acknowledge, that simply borrowing money to buy stuff and pretending the economy is growing, that was the myth. Ignoring all the debt and just assuming that, because the GDP is going up, that everything is okay, that's the problem. They don't want to acknowledge that we've been living in this phony economy because it's their policies that have created it.
What about the Fed, Peter, and their policy? How much of our problems today lay at the feet of the Federal Reserve?
Oh, a large portion of our problems can be directly attributed to Federal Reserve policy. If it wasn't for the Federal Reserve, interest rates wouldn't be so low. If interest rates weren't this low, we wouldn't have this ridiculous phony economy because people couldn't so easily borrow money. There'd be a higher cost there. We couldn't have had all this speculation. And, of course, if we had a legitimate Federal Reserve that refused to monetize government debt, we couldn't have these terrific budget deficits. Congress would be forced to act responsibly because the Federal Reserve wouldn't be there to bail them out.
From a recent article in the Digital Journal, Schiff, like Mark Faber, could see the U.S. with Zimbabwe-style inflation, where the Zimbabweans bring barrels of money to pay for a loaf of bread, end quote. I interviewed Dr. Mark Faber this week and asked him to comment on hyperinflation in Weimar Germany. Because, Peter, the backbone of a country, as you said, are those who work and save to help cultivate a healthy capitalist system, right? And they're wiped out in a hyperinflation. And many of those people in Germany fled the country or committed suicide because of their financial ruin. And then, of course, we had the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany. If we continue continue down this path of hyperinflation, what you're telling us we're on, how bad will things become for citizens of this country? What will life be like in hyperinflation?
Well, hyperinflation is about the worst possible environment, worse than just a depression. During the Great Depression, for a lot of people, it wasn't that bad. If you still had a job, you didn't lose your money in the stock market, if you had your money in the bank, prices went down. Consumer goods became less expensive. Asset prices fell for you. It was okay. And as long as you had a job or you had your savings, your money went further. But in hyperinflation, people with cash get wiped out. People who avoided speculating, people who didn't get suckered in, they get wiped out. The elderly living on fixed incomes, the fixed incomes are wiped out. People's savings, their wages are destroyed. So even if you have a job, it's going to be difficult to buy food. It's going to be difficult to buy energy because it's going to be so expensive. So it's worse. And that's the scenario that we're going for. Because all the actions that the government is pursuing to try to fight off the recession, that is what's sowing the seeds for the inflationary depression or hyperinflation if they don't ultimately do the right thing, which is one of the reasons why I want to try to get into the Senate so that we can do the right thing sooner rather than later, because the longer we wait, the more painful it's going to be to do it. And, of course, the more painful it is to do the right thing, the less likely it is that we do the right thing, which means the higher and higher is the probability that we do get the worst-case scenario, we do get the hyperinflation, and that's going to be a complete unmitigated disaster.
Some of their arguments are basically, or you hear people say, Peter, we really can't in reality service or pay back this debt that we built up as a nation. And so the argument is that we need to inflate. And I have an issue with that, and I know you do as well. But you talk about Greenspan or Bernanke. And my question for you is this: how bad is what this man is doing to our country? Because when you debauch a currency, Peter, you go right after the moral fabric and compass of a nation, do you not?
Yeah, exactly. And, if you make the logical conclusion that we can't repay our debt, which is obvious, we've simply borrowed so much money that it's beyond the capability to actually pay it back, that you're going to say, well, let's just try to inflate it away. I would rather acknowledge that we can't pay it and restructure it rather than create inflation. Because when you restructure the debt, you ask the people who loaned us the money to take a hit. Because, after all, they were the ones foolish enough to buy all the bonds. So we make our foreign creditors, we make the Japanese or the Chinese or the rest of the world or anybody who owns U.S. government bonds, we make them settle for 50 cents on the dollar, 25 cents on the dollar. We restructure. But if we decide to wipe them out by printing money, we wipe out everybody. We wipe out people that never loaned the U.S. government money. We destroy our economy. We destroy the value of our savings. We destroy the value of our insurance policies. I mean, it's utter financial ruin. I mean, maybe it makes the politicians feel better because they can pretend they're not defaulting. But that is exactly what they're doing. So let's be honest about the way we restructure or default on our debts. Instead of doing it through inflation, which will create even more damage, let's just do it like an honorable person. Admit we can't pay and restructure, and then hopefully our creditors will say, you know what, we're not going to lend you any more money, which is exactly what we need. We need our creditors to stop lending, because we're taking the money and making the problems worse. The money that we're borrowing is going to grow government. And the bigger our government gets, the less productive our economy becomes.
I agree with you on that, Peter. So let me ask you this then. When do you think inflation will start to intensify and really accelerate, if you had to put a timetable on it?
Look, I think inflation is already here. We're already printing all the money. The question is, when will the effects of inflation, rising prices, be felt more pronouncedly? And I think it's already there. I mean, if you think about, we're in the biggest recession since the Great Depression, yet consumer prices are not plunging. I just got my health insurance renewal for my company. My health insurance premium is up 18% since last year. I mean, 18% in the biggest recession since the Depression, yet my health insurance costs go up 18%. Food is going up. Oil is getting more expensive. Prices are starting to rise, despite the fact that the economy is contracting. I mean, that is very, very problematic. We need lower prices to help get us out of this mess. But I think at some point in the next several years, you're going to start to see prices really spiraling out of control. And by then, when people start to talk about that and react to it, it'll be too late. And, of course, the CPI is not going to capture all of the inflation or all of the price increases, because it's deliberately designed to minimize price increases the way they run it through the CPI. So Americans will feel the inflation at the supermarket or at the gas station or, wherever they happen to buy things. They'll feel it in their pocketbooks far sooner than the government reflects it in its statistics.
You bring up an interesting point there. And I guess I talked to Dr. Mark Faber about this also, not this last interview, but the one before. And my question for you is this, Peter, because you brought up the fact that we're in this weak economic environment, the worst since World War II or post-World War II, and yet we're having inflation. So then, and I go back to France when they had the assignat and they would just print money and do this stimulus, right? The same thing we're doing today. And the economy would roll over and the government would meet and they would agree, well, let's just print more money. And there would be stages of inflation in